We produce 400 million tons of hazardous waste each year, almost 13 tons a second. Almost 60 kilograms of hazardous waste is generated a year for every single person in the world, and the amount is increasing. In just one generation, the production of man-made chemicals has increased by 40,000% from 1 million to 400 million tons. Russia at 141.02 million tons and the United States at 34.79 million tons are the world's largest producers of hazardous waste. India stands at number 8. Sunita Kaul Zutshi recently spoke with Dr. Suneel Pandey, Senior Fellow and Director, Environment and Waste Management Division, at the world-famous institute TERI, short for Tata Energy Research Institute.
Thank you so much for joining me. And how would you categorize hazardous waste?
For the hazardous waste, there are two sources. In India, the way we categorize it and the way the regulation are built around that. One is industries which are registered with State Pollution Control Board, and they have to report to State Pollution Control Board and also to Central Pollution Control Board on how much hazardous waste they generate and how much what they do with it, how much is sent for recycling, how much is sent for recovery, and how much is.
So these would be basically industries or
hazardous waste, industrial hazardous waste.
Industrial, yeah.
Another source of hazardous waste is urban areas, municipal solid waste, which is categorized as household hazardous waste. Things like rusted batteries, paint cans, small cans, chemicals, aerosol cans. So all these become kind of household hazardous waste.
Okay.
The numbers obviously for household hazardous waste are lower, and industrial hazardous waste are higher. I mean, if you could look at industrial hazardous waste categories, it is reported that we generate around between 8 to 9 million tons per annum of hazardous waste, and much of around 50% of this is recycled or recovered in some way or another, and balance goes for disposal on secured landfills, which are managed by industrial operators. So hazardous waste definitely has a potential to cause pollution, and sometimes what happens is there are small generators who might not be, because of the quantity, might not be registered with State Pollution Control Board. They sometimes dump the waste indiscreetly, and that certainly causes pollution. Similarly, cities at this point of time do not have very robust management system for household hazardous waste. When I say that, what it means is they are not connected to these industrial hazardous waste disposal sites where they can put their household hazardous waste generated in their own cities. So all this waste also finally goes to the city disposal sites, and it's a potential source for pollution.
So what exactly would you term as household hazardous waste? Is it like Clorox and things, cleaning? What exactly is hazardous about household waste?
Generally, like for example, exhausted batteries in the home, paint cans, small chemical cans, which we use time to time in houses. Then solvent spray cans, then dew cans. These are kind of household hazardous cans. These are kind of household hazardous waste.
So are they large in proportion? Of the total quantity of waste generated? How much would you say is from industry and how much from?
Quantity is less because, if you look at overall waste generation numbers, we are talking of around 65 million tons per annum. And this doesn't include industrial waste. So an industrial waste is pegged to be around 8 to 9 million tons per annum. And if you look at hospital waste, it's further less, around 0.1 million tons per annum. But in case of hospital waste, though the quantities are less, but concern is much much serious because we are not only dealing with toxic kind of waste, but also waste which is infectious in character, and it can cause infection.
So at the moment at the moment, what is the kind of mechanism in place? It's supposed to be within the premises, within the hospital premises, but is it happening?
Initially, when the biomedical waste rules came, the first set of rules came in India in 1998. The large hospitals were given responsibility of dealing their waste in their own premises because the rules were evolving and common biomedical waste facilities were getting set up. So large hospitals, and they agreed that they would put up incineration facility and also waste disinfection facility in their own premises and manage their waste in their own premises. Some of these hospitals still manage these waste in their own premises, but most of the hospitals now are connected to common biomedical waste treatment facilities. And then, where they send their waste for disposal, and they pay certain user charges to these common facilities and send their waste to disposal. But if you look at overall annual numbers, again by Central Pollution Control Board, this in terms of hospital waste generation and treatment capacity, there's still some gap. So there's still some waste which is left, which is not. So there's still some waste which is left.
What's the kind of, sorry to interrupt you, what's the kind of oversight in place? There is you could be doing laundry, but then is it effective enough to get rid of all the hazardous waste, hazardous substances within the medical waste system? Are these contractors, so-called contractors, following the guidelines? How are they being implemented? Who's supervising? What are the metrics used to evaluate contractors, that the contractors following specifications? Would you enlighten us on that?
If you look at provisions of the rule, there's certainly a mechanism built in, which, if followed, should ensure that there's no leakage from the system happening. For example, rule clearly says that the bags in which this hospital waste is collected, they need to have specific QR code. And because now a lot of digitalization has happened in waste management services in India as well. So the rule says that these bags should have QR codes so that they can be tracked. And these coded bags should be supplied to hospital for disposal of their waste. And the vehicles which are operating to move these waste should be GPS enabled so that they also can be. But many times there are violations. Yeah, the hospitals say that they don't get QR coded bags. The operators say that they don't have enough QR coded bags, or sometimes what happens is the operators want to provide coded bags, but hospitals can't pay for that. So for that reason, somehow supplies are not there. So at times there's certainly scope for violation, and violation does happen.
In fact, you raised a very pertinent point because most of the hospitals, I would say 80% of the hospitals in India, to the best of my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, are government owned. So there's a stress on the number of on the money that goes and the accountability, and there's so much patients and coming from all over the country. So it's difficult. What do you have to say about that?
It is difficult, but if you look at, again, I'll refer to regulation again and guidelines by Central Pollution Control Board. If you refer to that, what it suggests is that a number of common biomedical waste facilities decided by a simple thumb rule, saying that in 75-kilometer radius, everywhere, there should be at least one common biomedical waste facility, catering to all the hospitals and healthcare service providers in that area. But the question is, larger hospitals still easy to track and easy to register and easy to connect them, and also regulatorily watch them. But smaller nursing homes, smaller blood banks, small pathology labs, it becomes really difficult for regulators also to cover all of them.
What's the outcome? What's the fallout of hospitals not following or lagging behind? What's the fallout? What is the impact on the health, or how does it percolate down?
That in that case, what happens is if they are not connected to any common service provider, then inadvertently their waste gets mixed up with municipal solid waste, because hospital also generates municipal solid waste stream, often gets mixed with that and gets disposed with that. So, and
how do
sorry.
you that? What does it lead to? What is the consequence of that?
The consequences would be, I mean, if this waste reaches a dumping site, naturally there will be infection happening at the dumping site. That's one, because of infectious nature of the waste. Second is, in case if the waste also contains, there's a category called sharps in biomedical waste, needles or glasses, ampules. If they also get carried over to dumping sites, there's always a chance of injury for the people who are scavenging in the dumping site for recovery of the recyclables. There's always a chance of injury. If the needles are not disposed properly, then obviously needle prick is also possible, and can be, I mean, there are many instances recorded where people reported hepatitis, the sanitary workers. And it can be because of this hospital waste not properly disposed and reaching municipal waste dump site.
Plus, I've also noted, and I've been to a lot of hospitals because I have an aging father and I keep coming there. And I've noticed that sometimes they could be not wearing gloves, and you know, it's hazardous. If they're dealing with hazardous hospital waste, are there any provisions to see that they are properly gloved and, you know, wearing the proper sanitation masks? And I don't see it happening.
Rules, they provide provision for that. A proper personal protective equipment and recommendation on what should be used. But often there's not enough training and enough sensitization of workers at the lower level. And the comfort generally is, I mean, if you talk to them, sometimes they say that it's easier for them to work without gloves. Wearing gloves actually hinders them handling various items. So often they remove gloves and start working with bare hands, or lack of goggles, protective goggles or mask. So there's always scope for improvement and more sensitization, and there's a need for a sensitization to these workers to make them understand that these personal protective equipment are going to help them protect them from exposure while handling the biomedical waste.
What would your recommendations be? I mean, in terms of what policy making and in terms of implementation?
I would say that regulation and rules in terms of whether they are adequate or not, they're fairly adequate. Because I mean, most of the time when rules are notified, they're discussed with experts within the country mostly. But the problem with most of the rules is implementation, the implementation monitoring and adequacy monitoring, because India is a large country, and it's many times, if you also look at, because regulators at the state level, State Pollution Control Board is generally the monitoring agency, they are also not adequately staffed in most of the states, and they have to, I mean, if you look at waste itself, waste alone, there are 6 different categories of waste streams which they have to monitor all over the state, and it becomes really difficult for them to monitor implementation of these rules effectively. So that's one bottleneck. There has to be, as a recommendation, there has to be voluntary mechanism, or I mean a market mechanism based approach, so that the polluters, because polluters naturally have a large role to play, they are sensitized, and they kind of discharge their responsibility responsibly, so that there's no need to monitor them. So, because if you wait only for legislation to work, that would not happen.
The
And
other-
often,
sorry.
and often we see that states claiming or regulators claiming that this year they collected so much fine, and the fine, huge fine in the sense. My take on that is, if you are collecting huge fine, that's not a good sign, because then more and more people are violating and they are not bothering about following the regulation. So I would like to see that lesser and lesser fines are collected, more and more people following the regulations, and less and less violations happen.
But the other thing is that most of these are, the health is a state-controlled topic. It falls under the state purview, and that is not always the most healthy of relationships. The federal and the state relationship is very tense in terms of, and also there's so much limitation to funding in terms of public hospitals especially. How much of a bottleneck do you see that, and how do you think this bottleneck could be overcome? Funding is not always adequate. So how does one have this kind of implementation when the funds are lacking, and it's very expensive to have these kind of hazards looked after or disposed of in the proper way? How does one overcome this bottleneck? How is India overcoming this bottleneck is the question rather.
I'll take the second part first. Regarding funding, it has to be a market-driven model where participating institutions and who want to dispose their waste on the common waste facility or users of these facilities have to pay enough user charges, and that needs to be decided at the state level, so that not only capital cost for establishment, but also operational cost of the facility is recovered from such funding, because then it becomes a completely viable model. Otherwise, if you keep depending on some fund to basically from either central government or state government to establish a facility, then it doesn't happen. Regarding central and state governance, we have a very peculiar situation, because Central Pollution Control Board is managed by central government, but the state pollution control boards are not natural extension of Central Pollution Control Board. They are, in terms of function, extension of Central Pollution Control Board, but in terms of institutional structure, if you see, they are under state environment department. So that is where sometimes what happens is a coordination is not as smooth as it should be. So a few years back, in fact, the Minister Jairam Ramesh, Environment Minister Jairam Ramesh ji, he tried coming out with an idea that there has to be a national level a regulatory body, which is also having much like US EPA in US, which has a extension at the state level also, and which all such state level extensions are also managed centrally, so that this agency can be independent in terms of regulation, in terms of monitoring. So maybe it's time again to basically think of such structure, which is independent of center-state relations.
So you're discreetly saying that there is an element of privatization seeping into the healthcare system, and eventually we may see that this sector completely sheds off the government mantle and becomes more private in its nature, and that will be really tough for the rural population that comes all the way because of the lack of primary healthcare centers. This was a dream, very old dream of India, primary healthcare centers. It never came about, never fructified, unfortunately, and so we have people coming all the way to Delhi. And so I see difficult times ahead for the common man, whether it's Canada or whether it's India, because here Canada too, there's a lot of pressure on the health system. One more question I'll ask you is that we were talking about the management of waste within the hospital system, but you have a very large petrochemical and I would say those kind of industries as well that have sprouted in India. Petrochemical, hazardous waste, and other kind of industrial waste. Could you touch on that? What kind of waste is generated and how they are managing that?
What happens is, if you looking at industrial hazardous waste, essentially in terms of quality, they can be, if you look at rules, they are divided into classified under 3 different categories. So one is which can be directly recycled, or some recovery of resources can be done from that. Second is one waste which can be incinerated, which has a calorific value, certain fuel value, and which can be burnt either with energy recovery or without energy recovery. If they are too toxic and no energy recovery is possible, then they can be simply burnt, incinerated in the incineration facility. And third category is the waste which is which has to be disposed at the common waste disposal site, where there is no resource recovery potential apparently, and no energy potential, so that it can be burnt also. So that has to be disposed on the disposal site. And so what happens is now the government, the regulators are trying to address this third category of the waste which is destined for disposal, to see, because government has given mandate to all the ministries to look for exploring circular economy opportunities in their processes. So CPCB has last year come out with a circular economy approach paper for industrial waste as well. And some of these difficult to recycle waste, they're proposing that some research and development should be carried out in the country in different scientific institutions, so that we can also evolve processes for recovery and recycling of these difficult to handle waste. But till that time, they will be disposed on the landfill site. And the landfill site's only issue is how long you can keep them in the landfill site. Because once you start a landfill site, for life, it remains as a disposal site. So you can't use that land which has been converted into landfill site for most of the any other useful, gainful purposes, even after the landfill site is closed. So that's a bottleneck. That's a problem.
I was thinking of the landfills, and I was wondering, can they not be, carbonized? I'm sorry, I'm a bit ignorant on this, but correct me if I'm wrong. I was just thinking, all the landfills, it's all solid waste. Can it not be converted to carbon, or is it a particular kind of waste that gets converted to carbon, and then there's sequestration of carbon?
It can be done. It can be done, especially if you're looking at municipal waste dumping sites, where you know that in terms of hazardousness or toxic, not much toxic waste has been disposed. Government is again trying to actively recover these dumping sites and use the land for alternative usage. Problem comes when you're handling a toxic and hazardous waste. That you cannot be converted into any other form. So that those sites need to be left like that.
Not even methane, and then use it for as a non-conventional source of energy. Can't do that. Not
municipal waste dump sites can be.
But
yeah,
not,
they can be.
But not
they can.
hospital. That's not possible.
But for that to happen, when you establish such dumping sites in the future, you need to develop them as a scientific sanitary landfills.
How does one do that?
Yeah, I mean, the way scientific sanitary, because now if you see the dumping sites which are in Delhi or Maharashtra or Bombay or Chennai or in larger cities, they don't have a permeable cover at the bottom.
Oh, I see.
So whatever rain comes, it seeps down to the groundwater, and also on the top also there is no protection. So gas keeps, landfill gas or methane gas which is generated, it keeps escaping. And sometimes in summer season they catch fire. So often you read in newspaper that landfill sites in Delhi are burning because of the methane catching fire. So you can only recover gas in a protective manner if these landfills are scientific, so that gas doesn't escape from here and there, and it can be collected and consolidated.
So it's a huge task. I mean, as far as it seems very daunting for India to be, for any country as such, but for India, its population, its waste generation, it's very daunting. Do you think it's possible that we'll be able to meet these kind of 1.5 degrees What the UN says that we shouldn't cross that barrier. How will they manage all this? Stock or you just optimistic?
Cost is certainly a barrier because these are huge dumping sites. We are talking of 25, 30, 40 million tons of waste being disposed over the years. So, but I mean, much like, again, I'll quote example from the US, where in past funding line called Superfund was established, and one by one they started cleaning up these dumping sites with the help of the Superfund, which was contributed by government. So here also similar model will have to be tried, a Superfund established by government at the central level, and that fund can be used for rehabilitating, redeveloping all these dumping sites one by one.
Happening? Do you see it happening anywhere? Is it started?
It is happening. It is happening, but at present, the focus is not on methane recovery. So for methane recovery, you would need a more structured approach. And after all the methane is recovered, then you can redevelop the dumping site.
Because then there's this whole system of, non-conventional energy being produced through these kind of methods as well. Instead of concentrating completely on solar and wind energy, there is a decentralization of the power network or power grid that could take place with the rural areas generating their own cooking gas or whatever through taking care of their waste matter. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, a bit of that is happening in China. I'm not sure though. I read somewhere that they are decentralizing and that's happening. But
it's not happening in India. China, you're right, it's happening in China because China took care that all those large disposal sites when they developed initially were all scientific and with all the liners and capping that they were developed. So for them, it is easy to recover gas. In our case, it is not easy because gas is escaping from everywhere in the landfill site. So to cap that and to contain that is really challenging and very costly now.
But do you think it's a possibility, a decentralized system where every locality has its own waste generating electricity or whatever through, the grid, a local grid which generates through waste material being,
yes. That is where we are now moving to. The focus now is not to take all the waste to dumping site. The food waste, the green waste, organic waste has to be managed at the community level in the small biogas plants. So, and Government of India is also going very aggressively on establishing something which we call compressed biogas plants, where I mean the biogas, if you see, it has a methane content of around 50, 55, 60%. In the CBG plants, what they do, compressed biogas plant, they enrich the gas with methane. They knock out the CO2, carbon dioxide, and the methane concentration is elevated to 90%, 95% or so. So then this gas becomes, it's called compressed biogas. And it can be then used either as an industrial fuel or even as a transport fuel. And
yes, a transport fuel, right. Right. But then the one question arises that comes to my mind is to form that kind of a grid, it could be a massive grid with decentralized inputs from localities. Do you think it's possible? Do you think it could be done? I mean, a national grid with inputs, it is happening. What kind of waste is generated in the hospitals? Is it mostly just plastic or is it needle?
If you look at, because WHO gives an interesting insight on waste generated from hospitals. And if you look at that, around 10%, around 85% of the waste generated in hospital is generally of municipal origin. All the packaging, food waste, generally generated by, say, hospital canteen, patients, daycare patient, outpatient departments, and the people who come to take care of patients. So most of it is of general municipal origin. 10% of that is of infectious origin and is categorized under biomedical waste too. and 5% of waste generated from hospital is hazardous, is categorized as hazardous waste. Their pathology lab, their testing facility, medicines, expired medicines, waste medicines, bandages. So 5% of that is hazardous waste.
But most of the emphasis is right now on rising sea levels and the climate change. I feel that there's very little attention being paid to this kind of this hazardous waste, or maybe there is.
I agree with you. I mean, more emphasis needs to be, yes.
It was such a pleasure talking to you. Thank
Yeah.
you so much, and